Hey, welcome. It's wonderful to have you. This is our last, well, actually, it's not the last STR event, but this is the last symposium. And what a way to end. We've got some editors here to talk about some of their perspectives. I want to encourage you to participate in the Academy of Management Conference coming up. If you're not already registered, it's not too late. But a special thanks to the Stronger Together Committee, Gwen and Zhao Li and Roberto Vassallo. And today, Audra and Evan Starr and Audra Wormald organized this event. So special thank you to that. But without further ado, let's get started. Thanks for joining us today.
Wonderful. Let me just share screen. Does that look okay for everyone?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this session on editor perspectives on alternatives to the hypo-deductive framework. My name is Audra Wormald, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland. I want to thank our editors for joining us today, and I'd also like to thank my co-organizers, Evan Starr and the STR division, especially Gwen and Tim and Paula. So I'm going to start by briefly introducing the session and let Evan say hello, and then we'll also let the editors introduce themselves and their journals, and then we're going to move into a moderated discussion with some questions that we've prepared ahead of time, and then we'll save some time at the end to have some Q&A with the audience. So please feel free to use the chat, put your questions and comments in there, and we'll be monitoring that as we go along. So let's start by saying, well, what do we mean when we say the hypo-deductive framework? This is a term that refers to the standard format of empirical papers that we typically find in our field's top journals. A paper that develops and then tests hypotheses within a single paper. We've all read this type of paper. Some of us have even written or published this type of paper. Okay, so this is just the traditional kind of quantitative type of paper that we see. So I want to start with a quick poll of the audience. Have you ever felt constrained or pressured by the hypo-deductive norm in management research? So go ahead and take a quick second to put in your responses, and then we'll see what everyone has to say. Five more seconds. All right, we can probably go ahead and close the poll. And we see 84% of you have said yes, you have felt constrained, 16% of you have said no. Okay, so that's just interesting data for us. And naturally, we also wanted to look at the data of what the actual journals had to say. And so let me stop sharing. There we go, the poll. And so, we went into the journals themselves and tried to calculate the percentage of quantitative empirical papers that adhere to this hypo-deductive framework, just taking the top 5 empirical journals as a snapshot. And we only took the last regular issue of each of the top journals. And the 2 columns compare the last issue in each journal from 2010 to 2020. And so on average, for 2020, there's about 76% of quantitative empirical papers from the top 5 journals that follow the hypo-deductive framework, compared on average to 88% in 2010. And so notably, we've excluded purely qualitative methods from these counts. And so we're seeing a bit of a decline from 2010 to 2020 in quantitative papers following this hypo-deductive framework. And what we see is that this decline is mostly driven by 3 journals: Strategic Management Journal, Management Science, and Organization Science. And so this along with some thoughts that editors have put out in recent calls for papers or in letters from editors, that they're on the lookout for some alternatives. So for example, S&J said, important and interesting strategy questions remain to be addressed that do not fit neatly within existing theories or prior understandings from traditional empirical research. ASQ has said, papers using quantitative analysis could benefit from more variation than they currently take advantage of, which is particularly clear comparing them with the best papers in neighboring disciplines. We present this call for a richer and more flexible presentation of evidence to make sure our authors do not constrain their papers unnecessarily. And so with today's conversation with our editors, we're hoping to build on this line of thinking by questioning the primacy of the hypo-deductive approach within management research and bring into the conversation some potential alternative forms of quantitative empirical work. So I'll just turn
Thanks,
it over to
Audra.
Evan.
Thanks, Audra, for kicking us off. Welcome, everybody. My name is Evan Starr. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, actually for another few weeks, and then I'm an associate professor. So looking forward to that. So I want to talk briefly about some alternatives to the hypo-deductive framework that you may or may not be familiar with. You can think of empirical scholarship that might address a new phenomenon, such as how COVID-19 is affecting strategy, broadly speaking. Or maybe there's a puzzling theoretical or empirical quandary that we just don't really understand that seems really important. You can imagine that there's a whole range of theories out there that are all that all exist, but we don't know which one is right. And so maybe there's empirical scholarship which seeks to test the viability of those assumptions that align those theories, and maybe separating out them just by looking at it empirically. And then there's also this kind of whole body of study looking using abduction instead of deduction or induction to develop hypotheses. And so I want to talk briefly about what abduction is, because there's a lot of definitions out there, but I think the clearest comes from this Heckman and Singer paper in AER in 2017. So let me just read to you what they have to say about abduction. They say the abductive approach asks the analyst to engage models and data in an iterative dynamic process using multiple models and sources of data in a back and forth where both models and data are augmented as learning evolves. Missing from current practice is recognition of the great benefit for knowledge of going back and forth with data, i.e. learning from it, revising hypotheses in light of it, augmenting it with fresh data and fresh theoretical insights suggested by new interpretations, and formulating new hypotheses suggested by the collection of new data. And so I think that this alternative approach is growing. It's popular in other disciplines, and it's surprising that we don't perhaps see it as much in the management domain. And so today what we want to talk about are three main topics with our excellent editor panel. The first one is, do the editors see the hypo-deductive norm in management research as a problem? And we're grateful here that we have editors from 4 of the leading journals, which have variation in the extent to which they have published different types of empirical papers here. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we did invite the AMJ editor to join us, but he declined. And so we're unfortunate to not have Laszlo Tahani. Secondly, we want to ask, if you're not developing hypotheses via the hypo-deductive norm, then how do you make a theoretical contribution if you're not going to use this traditional framework? And third, how open are journals to these alternatives? If an author wants to go down the road of writing a paper that doesn't follow the traditional hypo-deductive norm, then what are the roadblocks that they're going to encounter to publishing this work, and how can they overcome them? And so with that, I'll let Audra introduce our editors.
Thanks. So we have 4 wonderful editors with us today. Christine Beckman, representing Administrative Science Quarterly, Alfonso Gambardella at Management Science, Gautam Ahuja at Organization Science, and Rajshree Agarwal at Strategic Management Journal. So I'd like to give each of them a minute or two just to introduce themselves and their journal. And we can start with Christine and kind of move through in this order. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the slides at this point.
All right, so before the panelists speak, I would like to invite the participants to turn on your cameras if you're comfortable. I would love to take a screenshot so we will remember what we all look like in 2021. Okay, so I'm going to put in, so on a count of 1, 2, 3, I will be taking a screenshot. Smile. All right, just a couple more. We have very good turnout today. All right, thank you again. Bear with me. The lovely sound. All right, thank you so much. Take it away, panelists.
Terrific. Thanks, Gwen. Thanks, Audra and Evan, for hosting this. I'm Christine Beckman. As Audra said, I'm the editor of ASQ, a faculty member at USC. I've been editor since January. I was an AE for the 7 years prior to that, so I've been doing this for a while. Joined today by Chris Ryder, one of the associate editors, and Mary Benner is also in the audience, also one of the AEs at ASQ. Chris has published non-HD papers. Mary's accepted them. I've done both as well. So I just there's a real interest at ASQ in this conversation, and so glad really to be here. As many of you know, we look for a strong theoretical contribution at ASQ combined with strong data and analysis in whatever form that takes. So we publish quantitative and qualitative work, historical analyses, simulations, formal models. And so there's a variety of templates, I would say, that are seen as reasonable, and really more than the analysis that Audra presented would suggest. As she said, that was a snapshot of one issue. And my analysis over the last 5 years says that we've published, more than half of the papers we publish don't use a hypo-deductive framework. So I think that means there is really a lot of opportunity, and it's really important to sort of say out loud and to have a conversation about the alternatives so that we don't assume there's really only one way to write a paper. We also look for strong writing, and I think one of the reasons the hypo-deductive framework can be so useful to organize a paper is it helps the reader follow along. It makes it easy to follow, but there's many other ways to do that. And our qualitative papers that we publish would give great examples about how to make arguments. So good news is that there's a lot of templates, and ASQ is very amenable and excited to be publishing those kinds of papers.
Alfonso.
Okay, hello. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think this is a really exciting session, and I really think we should credit Audra and Evan for having this idea of this panel on this particular topic. I think it's not only timely, but a super important topic. And I also think that the result of the poll is actually suggesting very clearly that this is an issue that we need to discuss. I think so. So really big applause to you for choosing this topic. So here I am representing management science. And actually, to be specific, management science is a very large tent with many departments. Strategy, entrepreneurship, organizations are the fields closer to us. But of course, many other fields, decision analysis, optimization, operation management, and so on and so forth. So I'm actually focusing in particular on the strategy department of management science. I am particularly happy to be here also for another reason. I was editor at SMJ for 6 years. And then when I joined management science, the pandemic bursted, and it was, this is my first panel representing management science. And I'm quite happy because I did not have a chance actually to say what the philosophy that I would like to bring to management science is. So this is really a great opportunity. And that's an additional reason for thanking you for inviting me. Broadly speaking, the Department of Strategy of Management Science, which is what I am talking about here, it's very open to any kind of contribution in the strategy field. We have an editor's statement that I revised in the sense of adding a few things. So if you have the chance to go through the editorial statement for strategy in management science, you will see that together with Joshua Gans, who is the other department editor, we have now emphasized very strategy topics like no-market strategies, sustainability, of course, competitive and corporate strategy. So that department in management science is now really becoming a full-fledged strategy department, and you can consider it as such. I am going to elaborate on the kind of papers that we get, but of course we are very open to different kind of papers. Typically, management science takes paper with strong empirical analysis and research, but of course we are not limited to that. I will really stop here, and there will be lots of chances, of course, to clarify better what the position of the journal is. Thank you.
Gautam.
Hi. Folks, thank you very much for organizing this panel. I second both Christine and Alfonso's statements about the importance of this panel. And in terms of the journal, I'm Gautam Ahuja. I'm at Cornell University, and I'm representing Organization Science, which handles about 1,300 fresh submissions and 400 R&Rs a year. So it's basically a very high volume enterprise. And a lot of what I would have said, Christine has already said, so I will not repeat for the most part, because we also are open to a variety of ways to make a contribution. The measurement, though, I will make a comment about the measurement and issue that Christine also raised. But the first thing I want to draw attention to is that we interpret theoretical contribution in a very broad way, and we'll have a chance to talk about that in a few minutes. But there is a couple of things that I would like to draw attention to. As I see in the population of people attending this, there are a lot of students and potentially, and at least a lot of junior faculty that I recognize. And there are 2 points I want to make there. I think, first of all, the hypo-deductive term, we may want to sort of reflect on it really, because quite literally as a prefix, hypo means less. So it means it's less deductive, and in some senses represents almost a pejorative description. So I think that's a trivial thing, but it's kind of worth keeping in mind. I think the bigger issue is that I agree with the general statements that were made on this, on the fact that this HD approach has become, more popular and so on. But I do worry about putting numbers in there which are based on very small samples, because there's this old thing that the empiricist from Santayana, that he thinks he believes only what he sees, but he is much better at believing than at seeing. And my worry is that people may carry away a slightly sort of different impression for what the publication process requires right now. And if they go by this thing, and also in terms of the skill set that they are developing. I actually looked at the article. See, one issue that I think Christine also referred to is that qualitative papers are a large part of both Org Science and ASQ, and therefore that sort of excluding them seems to give too much of a transitional difference to the change. Right? I see both the level of that percentage and the rate of change as something that we need to be careful about. So I think I'll stop here by saying we should recognize that this is an important issue, and that there is, the journals are open to work, but we want to be very careful about thinking about that there is a huge change in these journals numbers on this, because that would require a much more systematic study. And I suspect that those, I have no idea what the correct number is for organization science, but I would be surprised if it was of the order that was mentioned. Thank you.
Rajshree.
Good morning, good evening. One of the nice things about having a virtual symposium is that we're all in different parts of the world and different time zones. I'm Rajshree Agarwal. I am currently a co-editor of Strategic Management Journal, along with Sendil Etheraj, Brian Silverman, and Vibha Gaba. I see also in the symposium, Giada is with us, as is Kathy Meriton. Both of them are associate editors at SMJ. And of course, I am a recent co-editor. I joined last year in January. But a lot of the strides in Strategic Management Journal are very much attributable to Will Mitchell, to Connie Helfet, to Alfonso Gambardella as prior co-editors who have been really, as it relates to the topic of this symposium, thinking about what kinds of papers are welcome at SMJ. And in many ways, within SMJ, at least through a whole series of even special issues on question-based research, on have been very deliberately kind of encouraging papers that don't necessarily follow the hypothesis testing approach. In this aspect, what does SMJ welcome? In fact, methods is a very important critical component of what SMJ takes very seriously as it relates to more general questions around philosophy of science. So we're very, very open to the idea that if you have tests of hypotheses, then of course we want to publish that, right? And you've got a whole series of, particularly in the quantitative sector, quantitative section, a whole set of econometric techniques that lend themselves to causal inference as in a hypothesis testing framework. But then, of course, there are all kinds of other questions where it may be an abductive approach that is more appropriate, or even inductive studies that are using large-scale quantitative analysis. So not only are we welcoming of inductive and deductive, abductive studies using large-scale quantitative data, we're actually publishing a lot of methods pieces, phenomena-related pieces, replication pieces that are very, very important as it relates to advancing science. And so one thing that I will say, however, is that there's often this assumption that if you're following abductive processes, then you're really not, you could be atheoretic. And as we go into the general moderated Q&A aspects, one of the things that I want to disabuse right from the beginning is that abductive studies do not have to be atheoretic. In fact, there are multiple ways in which you can contribute to theory, even if you're not testing hypotheses. More on this later. Over back to you, Audra and Evan.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. So let's go ahead and jump right into this moderated discussion, and we'll kick it off with perhaps our most provocative question, which is, as an editor, do you see this hypo-deductive norm as a problem in management research? Why or why not? And Gautam, I'm going to kick this question off to you because I think you started to get into this in your intro. And so if you want to add anything more here, please go for it.
Sure, sure, absolutely. I do think that there is, first, I mean, the short answer to the question, but as with everything in any social science discussion, the short answer reveals, hides more than it reveals. Yes, probably yes, but the issue is, I think, a lot more complicated because, I mean, as you know, Rajshree and Christine and Alfonso have also pointed out in various ways, there is in what ways is it causing limitation, and then are there empirical studies or contribution you're not seeing because of the status quo? And the way I would condition my response that yes, the question is complicated, and there is that you are probably seeing some of this thing. You have to keep in mind that there is a division of labor across journals as well. So, and a second thing you want to keep in mind is there's a competitive market for ideas. And many good ideas don't get published in specific journals because of competition from other ideas, right? That's another part of the same story. The third part of that is that research is done for a variety of outcomes and reasons, right? And it is to expand the mindset of the reader. It is to expand the set of alternatives available to the reader. It is to establish facts. It is to establish a causal understanding of the relationship between phenomena. It is to establish, the magnitudes of effects. And one of the things that kind of is important is that in a competitive process in a journal, if you're able to address more than one of these, there is that many more reasons for a reviewer not to sort of reject your paper, right? So in that sense, if you have a strong empirical paper, but which also has a theoretical basis to it, you're not hanging everything on the empirical side alone. And that's kind of important in itself. And as Rajshree said, and I completely agree, I mean, the reality is almost a lot of our papers that we publish is what we are classified here as hypo-deductive are actually abductive in the sense that there is a interplay between research and between data and theory. in terms of refining hypotheses, building hypotheses, and so on. The question is whether we want to call it that or not. And to some part, to some extent, that's never going to change, at least in our kind of social science, because our theories are, a pure deductive approach where you would specify upfront almost register what am I going to test and what am I going to find, is going to be very, very hard to do because our theories are too imprecise. They use messy constructs and they rarely specify functional forms with any degree of accuracy, right? Second, our theories tend to be very contingent. There's a set of questions which is like, is X true, right? In our world, given that we study performance as a field, performance is almost always a multidimensional or multifactorial causal outcome, right? Which means that it's often under what conditions X is true that becomes important, right? And when you do that, the interactions of many variables require you to be theoretical about how you kind of go about it. And the third part is that, and to play with it. I mean, is the best specification of size in terms of just number of employees? Is it log of employees and so on and so forth, right? And that is the third aspect of it, which is that the measurement is very hard. The next part of the other part that I want to highlight is that there are specialist journals that have developed with different criteria. For instance, Academy of Management Discoveries, which do serve as specialized repositories for these kinds of things. So in a competitive process, what is happening very often is, and the reason why you get a lot of these journals like that organization science says stronger theoretical contribution in addition to an empirical one, or in lieu of an empirical one also, is a part of this story. And if we remove this this restriction, does it mean more papers will come in? Yes, they probably will, but I caution that it may not be, that the large odds of getting published on a pure non-hypodeductive paper may not change dramatically, because to some extent that is already the state of the world. I'll stop here.
I'll just, if any of the editors have a response to Gautam, I'd be curious if anybody wants to jump in.
I completely agree with what Gautam is saying. I'd make two comments here. One is, Gautam, you're making a distinction between theory and empirics, and empirical and theoretical contribution. I do agree with that, but I don't think that non-hypothesis testing papers necessarily have a lower contribution. I'm not saying that you said that. I just want to make sure, because I know you and I've talked about this too. I don't want people to get the impression that hypothesis testing is more aligned with theory and abductive or non-hypothesis testing ones are more empirical in nature. I don't think you've said that. I don't think any of us have said that, but this bears, I think, huge underscoring because of a mindset issue that I think that we have been very guilty of in the profession, particularly as it relates to what we say to our junior scholars. And here I am going to very clearly underscore that the views that I'm representing out here are not entirely SMJ's. They're definitely entirely Rajshree Agarwal's, right? But as with many co-editors and with associate editors, there's going to be variation, and that's a good thing. But let me tell you why I do see this hypothesis testing dominant approach as a major problem. I'm reminded of the time when I moved from economics into strategy, and a colleague of mine once said, in response to my suggestion to a PhD student, that they had way too many hypotheses in the paper, in their dissertation. And another colleague that says, well, if you don't have any hypothesis, then how are you even building theory? And this approach or this mindset makes students feel like they have to hypothesize in order to theorize. And because they're hypothesizing causal relationships while they are mixing and matching their theoretical priors with what they're observing in their empirical context, in some ways they're being impure because now they're engaging in post hoc analysis. So there is this sense that what they're doing is not good research. And I don't think it's an issue of doing good research as much as assuming that good research is about hypothesis testing. I know that the 4 editors in this panel don't necessarily share this view, but I wanted to just put it out there as this being more often than not a view that I interact with many, many senior scholars and many current editors too.
Thanks so much, Rajshree. Christina or Alfonso, do you want to jump in and
Christine, you
add
want
on?
to say something or whatever?
I mean, totally right. I mean, I think there's so many things we could say. It's going to be hard to give us all turns. I guess I would just sort of add to what Gautam and Rajshree said and say simply, often a paper I would say written in a hypo-deductive framework that didn't come about that way doesn't actually work very well. And so you can see that in the review process. And so when you see things like, you know, the data and the theory don't fit well together, it's often because it actually isn't really, it wasn't driven by theory, and so rather than try and craft it that way, I think what we're all sort of suggesting is that you can craft it in a different way that follows perhaps more closely to what you did. And actually, I think regardless of whether what's more intellectually honest or not, the paper's going to work better if it more closely follows the process that you followed, rather than trying to impose post hoc a theory that isn't going to neatly fit. And that's usually, you can usually see that in the review process.
Let me just make a few comments along these lines. Going back to the question, is the hypo-deductive approach a problem or not, or why? Let me be a little bit provocative here, and I will do it with the help of a very good friend of mine, Connie Helfat. And when Connie and I were editor of SMJ, she used to have the following expression, which I like very much, which is novelty is overrated. And what did she mean by this? She meant that we are obsessed with the idea that each and every paper has to be novel on a very, very precise dimension, which is basically saying something surprising. So let me clarify. I have a small anecdote. I think you can find it in the web. Albert Einstein was talking to a young scholar who told him, you know, Professor Einstein, I have so many good ideas. And Einstein responded, lucky you, I only had one. And I think that to provide a new and profound theoretical contribution is incredibly hard. And what are we doing? And this is really, I am blaming me as an editor. What am I doing as an editor? I keep asking people who contribute, give me your novel contribution. So what do I get? I get people making tremendous effort to show me that they provide a novel contribution. And my sense is that on many occasions, they actually fail, but largely because of me, because of what I am asking. So the point I want to make is the problem is not the hypo-deductive approach. The hypo-deductive approach is like a hammer. I mean, I can use a hammer to actually nail a painting on the wall, and this is a great use of the hammer. But I can use the hammer to hurt someone else, and this is not a great use of the hammer. So I don't think the problem is the hypo-deductive approach. The problem is the way we want people to use the hypo-deductive approach. Let me give you one more piece on this. I think the key is to understand whether we learn. And we learn in many different ways. If I put a mask on my eyes and someone brings me into a room and describes the room for me, just a description, I learn. So papers, if I take a 2-year-old kid, a 5-year-old kid, and go to the park and describe to the kid what a butterfly is, what a tree is, this kid learns. So even description, which is the thing that we, if you want, we really put at the very bottom of the rank, it's an opportunity to learn. So I don't understand why papers that provide descriptions that are good and interesting for many people should not be part of the contribution. Similarly, we learn by correlations. If I tell you that smoking is related to cancer, it's a mere correlation, but it's a super interesting correlation. And then, of course, I would like to understand causal relations. But even causal relations are of different kind. Aspirin causally reduces headache, but we do not know the mechanism. And the mechanism is actually increase in blood pressure. But once we learn that the mechanism is increase in blood pressure, we know that we can use anything that increases blood pressure to reduce headache. So we have more general knowledge. But I think all these 4 elements are super interesting elements of knowledge. So hypo-deductive approach is as interesting as anyone else. The question is, are we only asking for that as opposed to the different elements that we can learn? Let me just conclude by saying one more thing. The abductive approach is also interesting. Why? Because it basically enables us to update over time what we learn, which is completely understandable. But again, we should really allow people to follow this. So let me give you this, and I will stop here. If I run an experiment with 100 patients checking a vaccine against COVID, and I get a result, then I can publish this because it's interesting. But then if I come with 10,000 patients in management science, to me, okay, let me make the case. What I do as an editor, I say, oh, that's not novel enough, because we already know from the 100 sample that actually this vaccine against COVID is actually reducing COVID. That's exactly our problem. Our problem is that we don't allow people to publish papers with 10,000 observations just because a paper with 100 observations on the same topic was published. And I think what is the abductive approach? It's exactly this. It's okay, with 100 observations, I get this result. Now I'm coming with 10,000 and let me see whether this updates the result or not. I think we should allow more for this scaling up of processes, for larger research programs, for replications in a wider sense. Replication is not just, oh, let me get Evan's paper and reproduce exactly with this data. No, Evan's paper works in the US. Let me try to see whether it works somewhere else under different conditions and so on and so forth. I think we should allow for more of that. So the hypo-deductive approach is as good as every other approach, as long as we have many different approaches. This would be my take at the problem.
Thank you all. It's so insightful to hear all of your perspectives on this. I want to jump on one thing Alfonso said to move us to the next question, which is that a perception in the field is that top journals tend to view theoretical contributions as novel theory building. And I think both Rajshree and Alfonso touched on this. And that usually takes the form of hypo-deductive or hypothesis development and developing new hypotheses we hadn't thought of before. And so I want to throw the first question to Christine, which is, is this the only way to make a theoretical contribution that is above the bar at these top journals? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think, of course not, right? Right. So let me sort of explain. I think to Gautam's earlier point, there is journals have different flavors, right? And so at ASQ, theory is important. So a paper that doesn't have a theoretical contribution has a harder road. It's not that it doesn't happen. There are some problem-based papers that get published. Then you have to really explain why this is a problem so worthy of understanding, right? That there's not theory that goes with it, but it happens. There's some well-identified papers that get published, but by and large, theoretical contribution is something we care a lot about at ASQ. And so I think you have to think about, what does that mean? What does it mean to develop theory? And there are many ways to do it, right? So what is a theoretical contribution? It's a critique that almost everyone, I think, has probably received in the review process at one stage or another. It can be hard to articulate. So if you think about a theory as a set of concepts and the relationships that describe or explain a phenomenon, so when a manuscript makes a novel theoretical contribution, it's changing or challenging or fundamentally advancing sort of the knowledge of those concepts or relationships or models. And it can do so any number of different ways. And so the question to ask when you're writing or reviewing is, how does this manuscript cause me to think about a concept or relationship or model in a way that I wouldn't have anticipated from extrapolating from existing work? And so how is it advancing theory in an important and useful way? And if you think about hypothesis testing as developing an argument and hypothesis testing, that's certainly one way of accomplishing that. But you can also say, what's the question and what are the mechanisms underlying that, and really trying to explore the mechanisms, or to try and corroborate what we know and then extend it in new ways that maybe we hadn't thought about before. So examining a puzzle and really trying to struggle through, what is accounting for this really can be done any number of ways. And in fact, I would say, Chris Ryder and I have talked about this, that the hypo-deductive approach really puts a lot of pressure on students to be able to anticipate, knowing the literature so well that you know exactly what it's gonna say, and then it puts really a lot of pressure to support those hypotheses and show that you're right, rather than really trying to understand and show the nuances of it. When are the effects strong? When are the effects weak? What are the boundary conditions? What are the moderators? What are the contingencies? And so that's what's really useful for theory building, is really to explore those things, right? When does support break down? When do the effects reverse? And really think about not just what we know, but what don't we know, and sort of revealing what Merton calls specific ignorance. And that feels, and it can feel risky, right? It's a high stakes game, right? But sort of it's the hypo-deductive sort of puts a stylized framework on it that I think hides a lot of the nuance and actual theory building that can happen as you're sort of understanding your results, understanding your phenomenon.
Thanks.
I'll stop there.
Great. Would Alfonso or Gautam or Rajshree like to weigh in on this?
Sure. I'll just build on Christine's response in a second, but I first want to very strongly endorse one of the things that Alfonso said, which was basically the hypo-deductive approach by itself is useful, but that doesn't mean it should be the only way to study. I think that this plurality of approaches is very much in line with what we would want to pursue in this field or most other fields. The second thing I want to is just building on Christine's, is that the way we interpret theoretical contribution, and I'll speak for organization science here, it's a very broad interpretation. It's not this idea, to go back to Evan's question, it's not that you have to come up with a whole new theory of something. That is a very, very, he didn't use the phrase that way, but I've heard this being used as you have to come up with a new theory of something. That's not true. What you have to come up is often, and usually that what happens, we don't have sort of Einsteinian theories of relativity ever being created, except across decades, right? Once in a while. We could, X causes Y, but then you could ask, and that's maybe, let's say, the main theory, you could ask, but hey, if X causes Y and Y is not a good outcome, then why does X happen in the first place, right? That is helping us nuance and open up the underlying assumptions, which is, in the if-then condition, which is standing for the if part itself. You could also argue that why Y causes X, right? The causality so far has been argued in one way, but in reality, it's in the other way. And you can see how that would fit in with, some kind of a treatment selection framework to show that actually what we interpreted as a causal relationship in this fashion is actually driven by the fact that the causality runs the other way, and we are selecting in whatever fashion, which seems like an empirical contribution, but it is still, it is actually expanding our understanding of theory as well. We have the common mediation, moderation, but there's another element too, just new abstractions, right? We abstract as, the idea of recombination as a source of innovation, right? That's a characterization of an important process in abstract terms that can be expanded to many settings without necessarily requiring a hypo-deductive approach to flesh it out. If you can flesh it out and measure it, well, that's one more reason that the paper is going to get published, because you have provided at least some plausible explanation of what, of this or plausible illustration of what you've done, which has added a new way of thinking about the problem. So one of the things I do want to emphasize is, and because I am not against the hypo-deductive approach, but if you are a doctoral student, if you are a junior faculty member, you want to be able to master that approach in addition to everything else. Don't, very simply put, if there's because remember, in our journals, Alfonso and I and Rajshree and Christine may want anything, okay? The reality is we don't control it, right? At the margin, maybe on individual papers, but for the most part, there's a social construction process that goes through the review, through the reviewer's preferences. And if the reviewer's preferences are slow to change, that is a real constraint on your career if you are jumping too far ahead of the thing, right? That was the reason why I said be very careful about interpreting numbers in these kinds of things, because the reality is that if you look at the journals, they differ in their historic origin, okay? ASQ, Organization Science and Academy of Management Journal were fundamentally journals driven by organization theorists, okay? They have a long tradition of organization theory. Strategic Management Journal was focused on performance and phenomena right from the beginning, a lot more than these three journals were, right? So the reviewers or the reviewer bases of these journals, even if they change, are not necessarily going to change at the same rate. So even if I want to say, look, let me take this paper, which doesn't look like anything we've ever published in organization science, and I will take it and send it through the review process. Guess what? It's the reviewers that come back to me. Now, I as an editor can override them, but that's a risky thing for me to do. And I don't like to use that privilege, responsibility, whatever you want to call it, because I use their judgment and then make a decision, but to wholesale discard their judgment has many, many negative implications. So part of this is a slow evolving process where imprinting itself has its effect. And the other part here that I do want to emphasize, why do we ask for a theoretical contribution in the first place, right? What is good about a theoretical contribution? And so one part I said is, well, we ask for it because that's history and imprinting effects at work. But the question is, are reviewers being irrational? Is this an irrational preference of something they learned and that's what they're pushing out? Or is there something more to this? So, I mean, the most obvious answer is why do you have external, why do you have theoretical contributions is you want to emphasize external validity, right? You can generalize in the illustration that Alfonso pointed. But that's not the only thing. When you develop an argument, and this may connect remotely to the idea that Rajshree sort of laid out of this conversation with her colleague. I was not party to the conversation, so I cannot, I don't know where the colleague was coming from. But here is the broader idea. Very often reviewers will send you reviews which say, well, the hypotheses don't hang well together. Or they'll say, why these three implications why are you testing these three hypotheses? Why are they these hypotheses and why are there three of them, right? These are the kinds of things that you see in the reviews, right? You need an overarching model to house the hypotheses, right? These are classic criticisms that you see in a hypo-deductive approach that is focused on first developing a theory and testing it. So the question is, what are the reviewers trying to get at? What is under these comments? And my take is that what they're basically forcing you to do is step back and develop a more comprehensive data generation process. That is what they're really referring to, is that if you make a claim about a population under study that can also be recast as an implication of, say, institutional theory, then housing the study in institutional theory may generate additional implications, right? But the other important part is that it may improve the empirical test itself, because now you have a pattern of results to support what you're going to say, right? Because that institutional theory corpus is going to generate multiple refutable implications. If your paper is only able to show evidence for one or two, but not the others, then we have to ask a question about, is the data generation process you are trying to reflect in that paper the accurate one or not, right? And so in that sense, it doesn't just, when we say there's a contribution to theory required, it is not just that we want to create a brand new theory. No, that's almost never the case. It is about conditioning, limiting the scope of, identifying the scope of that. Those are the kinds of things that we do. And very importantly, to build a stronger basis for identifying refutable implications and testing them in a way that we get a deeper understanding of the thing. And there's one other aspect of it. Making a claim through theory forces you to increase the precision of your claim, because the reviewer is going to say, you predicted at the construct level X influencing Y, but at the measurement level, you are taking X prime and Y prime, and there isn't a good correspondence between the two, right? And that's, again, that's a line of criticism that comes out from the fact that you had that theory earlier in the same paper. So it primes the researcher's mind, the reviewer's mind, to ask questions of you which might not have been primed in the, which might not have been asked had the mind not been primed in that fashion. So all I'm trying to say here is, and at the same time, it sort of forces you to this back and forth, this dialectic forces you to make a sharper claim. And if you think about the broader purpose of why we do research to establish facts, I agree. We do research to establish causal claims. But in a field like management, a very important reason that we do research is process. See, if the content or the output of our research was important, you would see a different pattern in how institutions function, institutions that run us function, right? You go to the top tier school, you go to the third tier school, each school has the same sort of evaluation criteria. It says research, teaching, service, okay? Now go to the research part of that. If you're getting published in one of these top journals, the average citation given by the citation rate is 5 to 8, okay, if you're lucky. Go down the journal pool and the number of citations or measures of impact gets reduced even further. So if you were looking at the product itself as the primary output, that should raise a question for you. Why is the entire institution of academia in social sciences, and probably so in basic sciences, but I won't go there because there's a different set of issues at play there. Why are they focused on this, making you do research which nobody's ever going to read and cite? Okay. And at least my take of it is that we, in our other role as instructors, are given by society the responsibility to clean up the thinking of others, right? That's what the instructor does in the classroom. Right? And in some respects, the research process, especially the theory generation process, forces you to make causal claims conceptually, right? And that is simply one of the ways that chains of logic get developed and help you to improve your performance in the classroom. Notice that journals and institutions who hire faculty, they could separate faculty on the basis of research and teaching, and they do, but the teaching faculty are called clinical faculty. The research faculty are all expected to do both research and teaching, so they do not have a specialization or division of labor by individual. It is by institution or by individual. It is within the individual that they expect both things to occur. And I think that's the important thing here. I've already spoken way too much, so I'll stop here, but I'm open to carrying on this debate. Yeah.
Thanks, Gautam. This is super fascinating discussion, and I want to give Rajshree and Alfonso a chance to kind of weigh in on this question. But I also want to highlight one thing that Gautam brought up, which was some of these roadblocks to publishing alternative forms of quantitative empirical work. And he mentioned reviewers. So if Rajshree or Alfonso wants to maybe pick up from there or respond more generally, turn it over to one of you.
Rajshree, can I go ahead or you want to go ahead? So let me just say a few things quickly, and so I'll let Rajshree then pick up on this. I will move from Christine and Gautam, and this helps me to clarify a few things and then get to your point, Audra. So clearly, my emphasis on novelty does not mean de-emphasizing theory. So let me clarify. So on the one hand, I think that I personally think that even every empirical paper is a theoretical paper, precisely for the reasons that Gautam was saying, and Christine also was alluding to. I mean, if I run a regression, my interpretation of these coefficients has to come from some clarification of the relationships of things. And on top of that, of course, there are journals, and ASQ is a beautiful example, that are specialized in producing theory. This is completely not only legitimate, but desirable. My point is that, and this goes to the hypo-deductive approach and your question, Audra, is that I think we are overemphasizing the extent of the theoretical gap. So The question is, the devil is in the details, it's not in the principles. Every empirical paper is a theoretical paper because we need to make interpretations of the data. The point is that if Evan publishes a paper in the US and I publish a paper on the same topic in Germany, and I find that in Germany there are heterogeneous effects that he did not discover in the US, and I have a theoretical interpretation for this, a potential response from the editors is, oh, that's not novel enough theoretically because it has already been shown in the US. My sense is that the pendulum is a little bit too much against the incremental theoretical understanding of the problem in Germany versus the US. And if you look at it not across countries, but in scale, the problem is even more important. If Evan publishes something with 100 observations, and I publish something with 10,000 observations, and what I show is that not only Evan's results is confirmed, but probably there are heterogeneous effects, and I theorize on why there are those heterogeneous effects, a potential response that I get is, oh, that's not novel enough, because Evan has already shown it. My sense is that what we have to address is the problem at this intersection. And this goes, the reviewer's point is an excellent point. I think, Gautam, you're absolutely right. I think many reviewers think in ways that make it hard for the editors to respond. But this goes to the point that Audra was asking. So what I would advocate for is, yes, let's have more heterogeneity. There will be hypo-deductive papers that probably make important contributions theoretically, and they are most welcome. But there should also be papers that basically take Evan's paper with 100 observations and show that the same result is true with 1 million observations. The mere fact that I show that what Evans conjectured, maybe with a brilliant theoretical insight, it's actually confirmed with 1 million observations. And because I have 1 million observations, I can actually theorize on heterogeneous effects. I think this is an important theoretical contribution, not just an empirical contribution. And my sense is that this is the way we have to think about the heterogeneity of approaches.
So I've appreciated listening to both all three, Alfonso, Christina, and Gautam, and as always, I keep learning from insights that they offer. I think we seem to be, so I think very well in terms of 2x2s. And I think that we're conflating two issues out here, though, because they're highly correlated to. One is, so if I were to do a theoretical versus empirical, and then a hypothesis testing versus abduction / induction as alternative approaches, I would say that especially it's changing, and this is reflected across the statistics that Evan and Audra have shown us. But there seems to be, in management at least, in our journals, this sense that hypothesis testing dominates in terms of theory building, if it is quantitative. If it is qualitative, of course it has to be inductive too, and then we're okay with it. Two thoughts that I have, and especially as it relates to answering some of the very specific questions that are being asked in the chat feature. One, first off, of course, abduction is about what is the best among alternative explanations for the relationships that you observe. That is very appropriate when you have competing theories. Right? So another way that when I at least first came in, it's not true right now, I was told not only do I have to hypothesize and then test the hypothesis, I also cannot have competing hypotheses, which means that theoretically I'm not willing to take a stand. Right? Now that second aspect is not necessarily observed as much. But the larger point that we want to make out here to you is that to the extent that our journals do have this tendency to say, let's test hypotheses. There are all kinds of philosophy of science issues that also come up. And Brent Goldfarb and Tim Simcoe and Andy King have written a couple of papers as it relates to p-hacking, all of these issues that you end up finding too, because when you're hypothesis testing, you're saying, I have a sample. And from this sample, I'm going to infer about the population. But there could be areas where your sample is the population, in which case you don't need to worry about p-values. The whole statistical analysis completely gets a very different interpretation, right? And then as it relates to generalizability, one way in which we can advance theoretical knowledge is to have, and especially as an industry evolution scholar, I tend to focus on doing entire censuses of industry case studies. So then my interpretation of the statistics is no longer about inference about a population. It holds true for that particular census. But then, of course, what we want are multiple different industry case studies from which other scholars can then build an integrative knowledge base. And this is where there's huge opportunity for theory building by doing meta-analysis at a later point in time, which is very different from hypothesis testing, but it advances theory nonetheless. So I guess on this issue of hypothesis testing being the largely dominant way of theory building is one that I would really ask us to revisit this issue, which relates to this question that's being posed in different ways in the chat feature, right? How do we get reviewers and journals to be more embracing of it? And I'll be honest with you, this is a challenge. And this goes back to what Gautam was saying earlier, right? As editors and as reviewers, we do need to evolve our mindset in terms of thinking and being more embracing in how we are presenting our work as so the production of research versus the consumption of research. One of the reviewers in a particular, so here both authors and reviewers along with editors need to be in agreement on how to do this. There was this one particular paper that I was the editor on. It actually was when I was in Org Science, Gautam. And I'll use this as an example. Here, actually, both the reviewers and I, as the editor, believe that the paper would be better served if it didn't approach it in the initial hypothesizing. But as Chris Ryder has just said in the chat feature, it's not about whether or not you put it up front or later. You can have a very careful discussion after you present the empirical analysis in terms of what your findings are and how that matters towards the theoretical interpretation, as opposed to putting it ex ante. But authors themselves have a very hard time because we don't have clear templates. The hypothesis being put up front is an attention focusing device if you are consuming research. And so there are advantages to having that. But again, there are also disadvantages because not all empirical analysis fit nicely in this ability to say, I can hypothesize and focus your attention on this relationship, and then I'm going to show it to you as testing. So I guess as reviewers, as editors, as authors, we need to get away from this imprinting of how we have read papers, as in, here is the theoretical hypothesis, and here I'm going to test. We need to actively change it. And we're doing that, which is very encouraging for me.
Thank you all so much for that robust discussion. We have about 23 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get to a really important question, which is what guidance you have for, I'm thinking here, junior scholars, PhD students, but even advanced faculty members in terms of publishing this alternative, papers that don't follow this norm, especially considering the roadblocks in the review process, the power of editors in determining reviewers. What guidance do you have to junior scholars who are trying to navigate this changing field, especially given some of the differences across journals? And whom I'm taking that up, Alfonso, I was going to pass that question to you. So you want to start us off?
Okay, so let me just, well, that's of course a very difficult question. Let me just tell you, and this gives me the opportunity to speak a little bit about management science. Let me tell you how I think we handle this at management science. So at management science, we really move throughout the whole spectrum, from very empirical contributions, if you want, to more theoretical contributions. So just to give you an example, at management science, we have these fast track papers. And essentially, fast track papers are papers which basically run one regression, make one specific empirical point, which is allegedly relevant. We use 3 criteria. One criterion is that it is actually an interesting and relevant result. Second criterion is that it could stir up a debate even outside the academia. And 3, it is something that can actually be specified in a few pages. And so those contributions, I would call them the extreme empirical contributions. As I said, every empirical paper is a theoretical paper. So when you actually set up a regression and show a correlation, even a correlation, and you are interpreting that correlation, you're definitely using the lens of theorizing. So I'm not saying that these papers are atheoretical, but clearly the contribution is largely on the evidence from the data. Then, of course, you can go to papers that maybe do the following. They identify precisely a causal mechanism that maybe in some other previous research has actually been conjectured, but not shown causally. And of course, management science also publishes fully theoretical papers. Many of these papers are formal theories, but of course, we are open also to other papers. So the answer on how to navigate on this would be the following. I think we have enough journals, including top journals, with different specializations, a diversity of portfolios. And my sense is pick the journal that actually suits most your research question, because I'm pretty sure that you can find the right journal for a research questions that is particularly amenable with a particular type of approach.
Thank you so much. Gautam or Christine, sure. do you want to jump in and just like, I'm curious on the guidance question. We're just getting a lot of questions in the chat about how do you actually navigate this process? So what would you share?
Christine, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I mean, I started, and then we've had other examples. I think one of the very clear things you can do is look at templates, right? So not for the substance of what they're talking about, but how do they structure the paper? How do they think about the presentation of evidence and the exploration of different mechanisms? And it doesn't have to be in your area to be useful. So I think look at some of those templates. They are out there, as Gautam said early on. I think there's quite a few of them, right? It is the norm, but not that 80% of the papers are being published that way. I think we don't want to overemphasize how dominant it is, because I don't want to scare people away from trying something that seems new when it's, it really isn't new. There's plenty of good examples out there. So I think templates would be an important place to start. As editors and as reviewers, I think it's important for you to understand and know that all of us have sort of talked about the importance of alternative templates. And so when we are looking at reviewer comments, and a reviewer says, well, why don't you put this as a hypothesis, this interesting result? We try to discourage that. That's not necessarily the best way to proceed, and instead exploring of mechanisms post hoc. We know that, and sort of to some sense you have to put faith in the fact that we believe what we're saying here, and that some of those alternative approaches are going to be more compelling and better for your papers. And I guess the third thing I would say is, explaining what you actually really did. What was your workflow? How did it actually come about? The Sutton and Raffaelli paper that I put in the chat is an AMJ paper where they wrote it exactly as it happened. And won Best Paper Awards in 1988. This is not a new conversation. We've been having this conversation for a very, very long time. which doesn't negate its importance. We just need to keep reiterating that there are other ways to do this. But rather than sort of using an HD framework to be very stylized, sort of showing what you actually did, how did you go about it, how did you think about it? We need to think deeply about the mechanisms and processes and practices that we're exploring, and sometimes sort of revealing more of that in the review process is actually quite useful. So don't feel like you have to only share sort of this very formulaic structure.
Evan, should I go ahead? Okay. I think there are 2 or 3 things here that I want to draw attention to, and responding in part to the chat. One of the issues that was raised in the chat in connection with this is, don't editors control what gets published, or is, reviewers are just recommendatory or whatever. See, in principle, that is true. In practice, also it is true. But there are very, very serious constraints, and I think Christine and Alfonso and Rajshree can speak to this separately, but I doubt that they would have a very different opinion from mine. See, if I make a practice of saying, well, I asked you to review the paper, but I'm going to, anyway make a decision irrespective of what you said, A, I disincentivize the reviewer. B, I may be doing it for science today, but what is to say it is not a personal preference or taste that comes into the picture, right? So objectivity is really something at the back of every editor's mind, is that it doesn't mean that the reviewer is always right, but I want to have good reasons for overriding a reviewer. And when those reasons are provided, I am able to do so. So it doesn't mean that, we can willy-nilly sort of override reviewers. We take their opinion. They are recommendatory, as you said, but we give them a lot of weight. And the second issue that was raised was, don't you select the reviewers? I wish it was that simple. I can tell you straight away that, first of all, we actually at Organization Science ask you to pick your editor and to pick your reviewers, right? We don't send it to all your reviewers, but we try definitely to send it to at least some of the reviewers you ask for. That's one thing. We do try to send it to your primary editor unless, a problem that is also common to reviewers shows up. Well, the reviewer and editor you asked for are just not available. We look for 2 or 3 reviewers, 2 minimum, usually 3 in Organization Science. Sometimes the senior editors have to go to R8 and R9 and R10 before they get 3 acceptances. So we don't control that process, that completely as you might want us to, or you might believe. And similarly, at the editorial level, editors may already be overloaded. So we have to do a lot of load balancing. And they may seem like non-issues, but they turn out to be very, very important ones. So that's the first thing, is that there is a limit to editorial discretion. And most editors are very careful in when and how they use that discretion, because of the risk of conflating your own personal preferences with science, which is best served by a broader, which is the reason we have this review process in the first place. The second thing I want to draw your attention to is that it's not just about what the journals do. We have a role and we have an important role. But remember, for most of you, there are also going to be letter writers. There are also going to be institutions that will make those decisions. And the letter writers are expected to provide qualitative assessments of what you've done. So just because, and especially at the top schools, just because you've gotten published in the right journals, that's only a start of the story. And if somebody were to say the words incremental or derivative or whatever, that could be quite a problem, right? So you want to keep that in mind also in this debate, that there is this idea that is there. Yes, getting published in the right journals matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. The third thing that I want to draw attention to is that journal boards are slow to move because ERB expertise is difficult to change as quickly as some major changes in the field might occur. And so the easiest thing that this comes into, where it comes into play, is that many of the things we study are also studied by economists, accountants, finance guys, and they routinely submit papers rejected from their own disciplines to us. Okay. Now, if we say that we're just going to look at what you've done, and it does not even have to relate to what is the conversation in our field and why we're looking at those things, then it becomes very, very difficult to sort of run a journal or build any kind of cumulative this thing. So you have to keep these kinds of things in mind, which you don't think of as an author when you're submitting. I don't think of it, but as an editor, those are some of the things that you have to worry about. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Gautam. Alfonso, I'm wondering if you would be willing to provide a few templates, examples that you've seen that can work as an alternative approach to the hypodeductive framework. And then Rajshree, I want to ask you to wrap us up on this question.
Okay, so yes, thank you for asking this question. Of course, there are many, many different potential templates, but let me suggest a few off the top of my mind. I mean, I think the first one that comes to my mind is probably a paper that has some special features. For one, because Audra was one of the authors, and for two, because this was the last paper I handled at SMJ. And this is the paper on David overshadows Goliath with Rajshree, Sergey Breginser, and you, Evan, to write in that paper or not? This is no, there was someone else in any case. In any case,
Sonali Shah.
Okay, Sonali Shah. Yeah, that's right. So basically, what did that paper do? That paper had a very clear goal, and the paper's goal was to show in a completely different context, which is Africa, basically showing that between multinational companies, between local startups and startups from the Western world, how was the competition going to play out for the basically money banking business with cellular phones? First and foremost, this paper collected data that from the point of view of a large econometric analysis were incredibly poor data. But if you think about collecting data in that context, on that particular problem, this was incredibly rich data. And what the paper did was basically to describe exactly what I was saying at the beginning. The paper was describing a room that I had never seen before. And describing the room that we had never seen before, the paper also showed that the local startups had this general skill and expertise of knowing the context, which actually went across contexts. So from the description of the room, the paper then elaborated a theoretical argument. And the theoretical argument was, what was the key asset here? A generalized skills about the room. So this is a classical example in which you have this, you start with description, you provide an interesting description in a context in which it's very hard to get data, and then you theorize. Another example I have is another paper at SMJ by Nikolai Foss and Jakob Lindsay. This paper used the usual incredible Danish data in which you know everything about everyone. And essentially what the paper was showing is that if you have a larger share of women in the top management team, you basically had more innovative companies. But if you had a larger share of female employees in the companies, this moderation was actually reduced. So having a large share of female employees was actually reducing the positive effect of a larger share of women in the top management team. So they provided this paper with this incredible granular data. The question at that point was, give me an interpretation. They came up with different interpretations, and the paper is now there for people actually to follow up and try to understand much better what the identification of these mechanisms are. And then, of course, there are the classical papers in which you have regression, discontinuity, identification, and so on and so forth. So this is just to give you a sense, and this really goes to the credit to SMJ, a journal in which these three templates of papers are actually papers that you can find. And of course, Rajshree mentioned us, but I think this tradition is being completely continued by the new co-editors. And this is what also I would like to try to do at Management Science. So Management Science is open to this kind of papers.
Rajshree, over to you.
Yeah, so if I were to summarize and focus on the very specific question of what guidance can we give authors on how to manage a review process, which is not a typical hypothesis testing approach. One, first off, all four of us have been saying to you, stay true to the idea and the data in your paper. So figure out what is the best match of how you would write the paper as opposed to just thinking about the hypothesis testing. If you believe that this is a better match on the non-hypothesis testing approach, right? Either an abductive approach, an inductive approach, starting with the empirical context and then theorizing at the back end, like Chris Ryder has been saying, right? Figure out what is it that makes it the easiest and the most compelling way to present your argument. Once you have decided that, and during that, right, this is where all of the templates that Alfonso, Christine, and Gwen, thank you, you're doing a marvelous job keeping up and providing these sites. I mean, this is just awesome. So you've got in the chat a huge set of very nice templates yourself, right? Read them. Don't force yourself to approach a particular one too. I would also recommend that when you're presenting your paper, I'm a big, big fan of peer reviews and peer presentations of your papers, right? Ask the audience. What I tell my students, and I do myself, is when I present a paper, I'm doing it very selfishly. I'm doing it so that I can get feedback from you on how to improve my paper, as opposed to prove to you that I have the final word on whatever this document is, right? Because I'm interested in learning and growing. So I tend to even start the presentation when I go out and give seminars. What I would most appreciate your help on is, and then I will say to you 2 or 3 things that I would really, really like the audience to focus on. So go ahead and ask the audience for help when you're presenting papers, when you're sending them to peer reviews, among the things, right? Is this framing working? Is it not working? So even during the stage at which you're starting to seriously write the paper after you've done the analysis, go ahead and crowdsource and get different opinions, and then sit back, look at what makes the best approach, and then write it. And then I would definitely use the cover letter very much, very intentionally. I would write, first of all, a comment that was already made before too, right? Different journals have different flavors. We all care about vertical differentiation, rigor, but there is still differences in taste across the different journals, right? So for instance, as the statistics showed that Evan and Audra showed, AMJ had stayed in empirical pieces, 100% of them are hypothesis deduction model, right? So you've got a flavor of the way that they approach it out there. So if you're sending to AMJ and you're trying to do empirical research with a non-hypothesis testing approach, chances are it's not a good fit. But even there, it is worthwhile in writing in the cover letter saying, I am not following a hypothesis deduction approach. This is the reason why, right? Approach associate editors ahead of time to ask them if they would be open to these non-traditional approaches. Suggest reviewers. Be very, very careful when you suggest reviewers about 2 things, and this is for junior scholars and PhD students. Chances are when you suggest a reviewer, that reviewer often we find is harder on you in the review process. So don't think that when you're recommending a reviewer, you're going to get a sympathetic voice necessarily. But the other aspect too is that when you suggest a reviewer, be very careful that there's no conflict of interest, because that reputational effect can come very negatively to you. But given that, suggest reviewers that would know and are experts on the topic, but would be sympathetic on these opposite things, because I cannot underscore enough what Gautam said to you. The review process works the best when authors, editors, and reviewers are aligned on making the paper better and willing to put taste preferences aside, but keep rigor or vertical differentiation standards as high as possible. And when editors have to override reviewers, for me, that's a failure of my review process. I either did not match the reviewers and the author team well, or there was a serious breakdown that's happening out there, right? So like Gautam said, I don't want to exercise that option, even though I have and will in situations. So I guess this is help. I don't know if this is giving what you, Audra and Evan, wanted us to give as a snapshot of, you know, just taking it right from the time when you're ready to write all the way to when you're submitting, right? Some tips and tricks on how you can manage the review process as it relates to this issue of non-traditional hypothesis testing papers that you're writing.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the time and we're just about out of it. So I'm going to wrap us up just by saying thank you so much to everyone and to our editors in particular for sharing your time and your thoughts. I'm starting to reflect on what I've been learning throughout this session. And really one of my biggest takeaways is this wonderful impression of how deeply our editors think about and care about these issues. So thanks for the fascinating discussion on the topic of whether and to what extent there's a role for alternative forms of empirical inquiry in management scholarship. And I believe the recording of the session will be available online soon. Hopefully we'll have the details for you in the chat. And with that, thank you everyone and have a great rest of your day.